Why are Indians so obsessed about pressure cookers when they fly abroad? How did dosas become synonymous to South Indian cuisine? And why do people leave their homes and migrate to a different city which has a different language and culture altogether? In today's episode of Beyond Frameworks, we talk with Prof Chinmay Tumbe, who has researched on migration for over a decade. We talk everything migration and how mangoes, dosas, and pressure cookers have a connection in them.
What can mangoes, dosas, and pressure cookers tell us about migration? Let me start with mangoes. All of us love mangoes in India, very proud about where they're grown. Each one of us have a very strong connection. And the mangoes I love the best are what are known as the Alfonso mangoes, Apus, which comes from a place called the Konkan region in India. What's lesser known about the Konkan region though is the mass migration that's been happening since the late 19th century all the way today. Did you know, for example, the sex ratio of Ratnagiri has shown consistent female surpluses because the men are away. They're working in Bombay or Mumbai, they're working in the Gulf, they're working in different parts of the country. And what's really fascinating is that they don't actually settle down. Most of them, they actually go back to Ratnagiri. This is what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. Over 20% of Indian districts have exhibited persistent, voluntary, mass, circular migration for more than 130 years. And the Konkan region, which produces mangoes, is the classic symbol of that. And that is why the joke of the Konkan region is that it's not only famous for mangoes, but also quite literally man-goes. Coming now to dosas, which is another dish which is hugely popular all over India. The story really that has to be explained is how did this become popular? Why is it that South Indian food is now eaten across the country? And the district that we associate South Indian food across the country is a district called Udupi, which is just south of the Konkan region. And just like in Ratnagiri, it's the men who have migrated all over India, worked in different restaurants, created this Udupi South Indian brand, but very rarely settle down in those places. They come back and then their sons go out and take their jobs. Udupi is also a district which is part of the Great Indian Migration Wave. You have other districts, Ganjam in Odisha, Azamgarh in UP, Saran in Bihar. I can go on and tell you about different districts across India, but you get the point by now that India, when you say migration in India, it is a very long running story. You have communities which grow up expecting to migrate. If you grow up in Kerala today, for instance, you are expected to move out at some point of time in your life. It's seen as a rite of passage. Compared to if you're born in Madhya Pradesh, where migration is not generally seen to be the norm, the societies are structured in a very different way. Migration also leads to remittances. You get a completely new definition of the economy. Kerala, for instance, is hugely dependent on migrants' money that comes from the Gulf, just like Bihar's economy is hugely dependent on money that comes from Kerala or Gujarat or Maharashtra. India, therefore, is hugely interconnected, and many of the stories like mangoes or dosas are intimately linked with the travels of migrants across the subcontinent. The pressure cooker story is very interesting because that really relates to international migration. There are about 30 million Indians now outside. And as I've written in my book, India Moving, just to jest, that two items which most Indians pack before going abroad, one, the mug, and two, the pressure cooker. And the idea of the pressure cooker being such a strong Indian symbol tells you about an object which is at the heart of so many international migrants who go from India, who love not just cooking, but also the noise associated with it. And especially when you go abroad, when it's very quiet, that noise often reminds you of the hustle and bustle of Indian life. So dosas, mangoes and pressure cookers in their own ways tell us so much about both internal and international migration. There are many types of migrations in India, and to really understand migration in India, you have to ask the question, why do people move? The first most fundamental basic reason for moving in India actually, and most people don't connect with this, is actually marriage. Most migrants in India are actually women and they move upon marriage. So if you move from one village to another, you move from a village to a city upon marriage, you are technically a migrant, And that is why, as per the census of India, over 300 million women are migrants. This migration has been happening throughout history as far as we can remember, which means maybe even more than 2000 years. This is the longest running migration system of India, which we don't usually see as migration. We then come to migration for work. In India, predominantly dominated by men, predominantly in areas known as what I describe as the Great Indian Migration Wave, places which are dense like Kerala or Bihar, places which in some cases are battered by climatic shocks like coastal Odisha. You have a cyclone every 10-15 years, very fragile ecosystems which lead out migration. These migrations are intensifying because with climate change we are seeing more vulnerability of livelihood and ecosystems across the subcontinent, which means one big shift that's happening from what was happening earlier is that more communities are now prone to outmigration because of climatic shocks. You then have also international migration, not just for marriage or work, but for a variety of reasons. And for example, students and education, going to study is such an important part now of the overall quantum of migration, both within the country and outside. This is, of course, the volume of it has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Just think of the crisis today in Ukraine. We are saying there are 15 to 20,000 students, Indian students studying in Ukraine. Would you have seen that in the 1970s or 80s? Simply not. So our migration patterns in the last 30 years have diversified to newer destinations within the subcontinent, outside the country, and it's not all bad because a lot of these migrations create new links. Think of our IT industry in Bangalore, which is almost completely created through migratory links connecting USA and India. Or think of the health ecosystem of India, which again was a lot of it set up by returning NRIs or non-resident Indians. Or think of the $80 billion worth of remittances that India gets from outside. As a result of which, migration and the fast evolving patterns of migration of the last 20 years, whether it's for climate change, for international or internal education, more women who are participating in migration streams, these are the newer trends in migration. In terms of geographies, some have been there throughout. For example, Bihar and Kerala, two ends of the spectrum. Some are emerging. For example, West Bengal has emerged as one of the major origin states of outmigration in the last 20 years. But I would say the biggest change that's happened in the last 20 years is what I call as the north to south migration. That is, within India, as South India progresses faster than the northern Indian hinterland in economic terms, what was earlier a linguistic barrier, for example, the Bihari person would choose Gujarat or Maharashtra rather than Tamil Nadu purely because of ease and familiarity of language. Today, the wage differentials have opened up so much that that same Bihari worker does not mind learning Tamil and working in Tamil Nadu because the wage differentials have opened up that much more. And that is why in the next 30 years, the north to south migration is going to be probably the biggest wave of migration, which is new, which has not happened, and which will also put a huge stress on political relations across states. What you also see very new is this almost complete consensus across political parties in India of seeing the migrant as some sort of a villain. Virtually every political party of India wants to have a quota, a state level law which says 75%, 80% reservation for locals. These are anti-constitutional laws. Indian constitution guarantees free movement of labor. So these are some emerging trends in what we would call as patterns of migration in India. If you look at the world of Indian business, we intuitively know that there are few communities which have historically been associated with it. Partly because caste, particular caste orders which have been assigned business as a role, but also because there are particular states and provinces of India historically which have generated what we call as traditional business communities that still have a huge dominance in the world of particular sectors or for that matter big business in India. We're really talking about 5 or 6 communities. We're talking about the Marwadis, the Gujaratis, the Sindhis, the Punjabis, you can say Kutchis, and one community which is lesser known today, the Chettiars, which are south. What's fascinating is that most of them, if you see the word Marwar, Gujarat, Sindh, ascribed to regions in the western part of the country. Why is it that a few of these communities have gone all over India, all over the world and dominated certain sectors at different points of time? This is a fascinating question which historians, sociologists, researchers still struggle to grapple with. But what we do know is that these communities physically migrated in the span of about 300 years to every nook and corner of the subcontinent. Think of the Marwadis from Assam to South India. Think of the Gujaratis in Coimbatore. One aspect of these communities that comes out is not just risk-taking, which is very important for entrepreneurship, but adaptability. Also, very good calculations to move when you see opportunities decline. Think of the Marwadis in Calcutta. Many people associate the business houses of Calcutta with the Marwadis. And yet, the largest contingent of Marwadis today is found in Maharashtra, not just Mumbai, but the entire district belts of northern Maharashtra. You can see what happened in the last 40 years. Very quick to see the locus of economic geography move towards western and southern India. The community themselves have migrated. The newer generation folk have gone to take on new opportunities outside Calcutta. So these communities are very flexible, very quick. Having said that, there are also new communities which were traditionally outside the fold of business castes, which are storming the world of Indian business. Think of the Saurashtra Patels in the diamonds. Think of the Gaundars in Tirupur cotton textiles. A variety of castes and communities in India now are increasingly entering business. But just like the Marwadis or the Sindhis or the Punjabis, they are also using the community or caste networks to raise themselves through it. And that's why we say Indian business is still linked heavily with caste community, even though the range of that has diversified immensely in the last 20 or 30 years. And migration is a very crucial component of that, as communities physically move from one place to another to widen their networks. When the national lockdown was announced, March 24, 2020, what India witnessed was an unprecedented reverse migration exodus. As the epics like the Ramayana and Mahabharata were being played out on the television screens, which also have exile as a very important part of their themes, what we actually saw on the streets were people walking back home in complete human misery. This was tragic, this was not really necessary, but it also exposed the tremendous circularity of migration in India, where people have one foot in the village and one foot in the city. As I've called this the Great Indian Migration Wave, this affects more than 200 million people in India, and the migration crisis of 2020 for the first time visibilized an invisible class of migrant workers. Is this reverse migration sustained? Have people come back? What do we really know about this? We do know that 2 years into this pandemic, a lot of the people simply don't have enough economic opportunities back in the villages and hence have made it back to the cities. We also know that many cities which did not treat their migrants well, those migrants have been forced to diversify and choose new destinations which can arguably give them a better shot at life. A lot of people have said maybe reverse exodus was good because now people will focus on source regions and maybe people will not have to migrate. On that, I'll just say that migration is a personal choice. We have to leave the choice to people as to where they want to be. You can provide as many economic opportunities in various parts of India, but migration as a historical process is in a way inevitable. In India, in fact, what we often seen is that as states have become richer, migration often actually increases, it doesn't decrease, because aspirations change. So we should not see migration as something bad. It is inevitable as a part of economic development. And while this reverse exodus was a one-time phenomenon, in my view, it has led to people, both migrants and employers, to fundamentally reconsider their employment contracts and ensure that the workplaces are hopefully no longer as vulnerable as they were earlier. A lot of good government policies have happened after the lockdown. For example, the One Nation, One Ration card, intrastate portable social security. We need much more of these policies to make migrant workers feel at home. But the long-term arc of migration in India is not reverse, but the exodus which was already happening for more than 100 years, which is from villages to cities. We've seen hundreds of millions of people in China move from farms to factories. This is an inevitable part of economic development everywhere in the world, and in a way we need more of it. I would end by pointing out that Ambedkar had a very clear view on this, saying that the city is the place of liberation, and he exhorted people to move away from village life to city life. Gandhi, on the other hand, celebrated village republics. And this is a tension we keep seeing in India, the Ambedkarite view of moving to cities versus the Gandhian view of staying in villages. Which view will trump? My sense is that the historical answer is very simple. People will be still moving to cities even in the future, even though the pandemic might have recalibrated some of these decisions for some migrant workers who unfortunately caught out in a big way when the lockdown happened in 2020.
Beyond frameworks,